in two places, including the website, in accordance with requirements of RSA 91-A:22. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Alderman Tim Senate is here. Alderman Derek Tebow.
Here.
Alderman John Sullivan. Here. Alderwoman at Large Shoshana Kelly.
Here.
Alderman at Large Lori Wilshire.
Here.
Alderman at Large Michael B. O'Brien, Vice Chair. And Alderman Richard A. Dowd, Chairman.
Present. Also in attendance?
Also in attendance, we have Alderman Klee, Alderman Thibodeau, Tim Cummings, Director of Administrative Services, John Griffin, CFO, Don Enright, Treasurer Tax Collector, and Matt Sullivan, Community Development Director.
And Megan Karen.
I didn't see Megan walk in. Megan Karen.
Okay, roll call. The agenda has a first public comment, but that's not necessary since there are no actions being taken at this meeting, and the first public comment is for anything that's being acted upon at that meeting. There will be a second public comment period at the end. Communications?
Communication has been received from Tim Cummings, Director of Administrative Services, regarding providing an overview and general discussion on fiscal year 26 operational budget.
There being no objection, I'll accept the communication and place it on file. Discussion, FY26 operational budget. I'd like to recognize Administrative Services Director Tim Cummings. Do you want to just have everybody come up?
If I could, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yes.
Ordinarily, you would allow a first public comment on communications that are part of the board packet.
We're not acting on anything, and that's the way the first public comment period is written by legislation. So there is no first public comment period.
Saying you're acting on the communication.
We're not acting on the communication. That was just to inform us that the meeting was being requested.
It doesn't require
You
sarcastic remarks.
right here. Here. let us, sir. You find a seat? Okay. My bag does not need a seat if we need to.
You shouldn't, oh, this is not on.
This is yours.
Okay.
Just hit displays off for a second. You're trying to screen.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay.
Now you tell me.
You gotta put display on.
Yeah, I thought I
They're trying to get the screen up.
Here we go.
Do you want me to, you want to give me the remote?
Great, now that we have the technical issues resolved, Director Cummings.
Great, thank you. For the record, Tim Cummings, Director of Administrative Services. To my left, we have Megan Karen, Chief of Staff. To her left, we have CFO Griffin. To my farther left, we have Don Enright, Treasurer Tax Collector. And to her left, we have Matt Sullivan, Community Development Director. We wanted to come before you this evening to have a high-level see if I can get this to work. All right. We wanted to come before you this evening to have a high-level overview, discussion about the budget so we could talk about the trajectory that we're on, make sure that we can align where we're going, and make sure we're planning on how to get there. We're going to try to develop a consensus on our budgetary and financial goals. I'm hoping to keep the conversation tonight informal, wanting to really have this as a discussion, to talk about, you know, how we as the administrative team are starting to see and craft and develop the budget as we are at the early stages of that. So We will be crafting the budget over the next few months, and as you hear later on in the conversation tonight, we're going to be looking to discuss, a 3% operating increase with no net new positions. That is the concept that we're contemplating right now, and wanted to kind of talk through with you what that really means as we continue to develop the budget and have this dialogue. Everything that we're talking about here tonight should be considered fluid, as it's an evolving conversation.
Question.
Yes.
Just for clarification, you said 3%. Has it changed since you made the slide, or did you
Three,
just misspeak?
I'm sorry, I should say 3.5%.
Thank you,
And if I had my way, it would be 2%, but.
thank you.
But 3.5% operational increase. So
Thank you.
Megan Karen's here. She's going to talk a little bit about the year in review and how we're doing.
Yes, thank you for the record. Megan Karen, Chief of Staff. Just quickly before we get into the bulk of the presentation, the end of fiscal year '24, we had a total surplus of about $25 million, 10 million of which were appropriations not spent. We always try to budget conservatively, and here we actually received additional school revenue after we had submitted our proposed budget. John and I discussed that today, so that's not usual. That just seemed to be with the timing that we received that.
Next slide.
Yes. And then again, just very quickly, this is a comparison of the percent of our operating budget that has been expended. We're right on par. This time last year for fiscal '24, we expended almost 57% of our budget. This year, we're at about 59%.
So I'll hand it off to CFO Griffin to talk about the budget creation and some assumptions.
Thank you, Director Cummings. John Griffin, CFO. The first slide is something you've seen the last several years, and that is my attempt to calculate the amount under the spending cap. How we begin that calculation is we take the approved, adopted fiscal '25 budgets for general fund, enterprise funds, and special revenue funds that include grants. You probably remember that number, $456 million. In the last several months, as we had done in the prior 2 or 3 years, we recognized the revenue that Chief of Staff Karen just mentioned, and we used it based on the needs of the city in a couple of different ways. Some are to fund capital improvement projects. Some are to fund general fund projects. And the grants and special revenue, as well as enterprise funds, sometimes we get unanticipated grants or unanticipated revenue. The unanticipated revenue might be the opioid monies. Unanticipated grants might be some other grants that were received from the federal government or the state government. And as we've done in the past, these supplement the budget. So we take the adopted budget, we supplement the budget. The big number in the capital projects is bonding. We've recognized the face value of the bonds historically as those bonds add to the budget. For this purpose, we come down with the prior fiscal '25 budget. We add the $32.3 million. We get $488 million, roughly $489 million. The state and local government implicit price deflator for the last 3 years is tracking at 3.9%.
3.9.
Last year, 3.9. Last year, it was over 5. And unless something happens, that number is going to go down lower as the years go on. And that's the number that you were talking about last Monday as the index that you would use to apply to any type of tax cap calculation. So we're adding to the $488 million, adding the $19 million, so we have $508 million as a cap. And the total of the budget that we're looking at tonight, we're just looking at the general fund and SURF, but we would be under the cap if we did not increase in large measure some of the items above the bond resolutions, enterprise funds, et cetera. Does anyone have any questions on this particular calculation?
Alderman Sullivan?
Thank you. My first few questions on this. First, on the spending cap. We got into trouble last year because we budgeted right up to the cap. Looks like we're doing that again. That's a concern. Would you share in my concern?
I would think that based on my participation and understanding where the board may want to go with regard to a tax cap as opposed to a spending cap, I'm not too concerned. I think if you look up in the top right, we've got that 25 million there. That's a big number. To the extent something happens during fiscal '26, you could make some other changes. So you'd have some cap room there. In fiscal '26, you have the one-time option to exempt the debt and/or the capital improvements. And I think you'll have enough room. If the team doesn't want, if the Board of Aldermen doesn't want to exempt debt or anything like that.
Alderman Sullivan, follow-up?
Thank you. You mentioned in the previous slide that your goal was a 3.5% increase on the operating budget. From what I can see, 347.90 to 358, 632 is about a 5.2% increase.
We'll get there. We're not there yet, but yep.
Okay.
Any other questions at this time? All right.
So this gets to what you were talking about.
So this is the proposed budget analysis as of today. And what we're doing is we're recommending that lines 1 through 15 limit their increases to 3.5%. Now, as you recall, the lines 1 through 15 do not include other labor-related costs such as FICA, Medi, pension, and benefits. And you were updated on the benefit situation a few weeks ago when Director Cummings and Mr. DeLacy came in and explained how that benefits line is difficult to manage at this point. So the 3.5 times last year's 231.8 million results in slightly over an $8 million increase to the operating budgets, which you folks review diligently during the budget review process. Pension, I've got an estimator there at 4. I'm trying to determine whether I can bring that down to 3.5. And the FICA Medi, those might be able to go down to 3.5 as well, but they're not material dollars at this point. The benefits.
If I could.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. So the benefits line, again, Tim Cummings, Director of Administrative Services. Everything we should be saying should be prefaced with, we're still early, and these numbers are going to evolve. And so as CFO Griffin was just mentioning, he's hoping to pull down that 4% on the pensions, maybe a little bit, so it's a little bit under that 4%. I'm going to say just the opposite with the benefits. I don't see us moving the benefits percentage down any further than the 10% that we're showing right now. We've already brought it down from last year from just over 13.5% down to about 10%. In speaking with our consulting team, I think at this point in time, this is as best we can do. As we gain more data and that recommendation changes, we can come back and revisit this, but at this time, I wouldn't recommend doing anything lower than the 10%, but it is an improvement from where we were last year, when we increased it by 13.5%. Thank you.
Mr. Griffin?
And if we go down to the other costs, which are not, they're more, they're different than just a straight percentage of 3.5%. The debt service, I'm happy to report that did not go up according to plan as much as we had predicted. That's going up 1.93%. Contingency, I brought that down just to show the general contingency, which is usually $250,000. The difference between the 596 and the 250 is contingency for negotiations, most notably the UAW contracts. We get to interfund transfers. This is where we always carried a line for SURF, but we were unable to put the SURF appropriations in the budgets. If you recall, for several years, we used escrows, and last year, we used a supplemental appropriation of assigned fund balance. So it was my thought, listening to the budget team and the Board of Aldermen members on the budget team and other members, that you really wanted to see that large of an item. You wanted to see that in the budget. So I put that in the budget, so you can see it's a 5 million number that I put in the calculation just before it. I had 6 million, but that can be adjusted. So this would be 5 million to purchase vehicles and other capital equipment that all of the departments use, including the school district, police, fire, Department of Public Works. And I'm going to share with the team here how we could possibly fund it in the first year, and I'll get into that in a second. With regard to capital improvements, we met as a group. As much as we would like to fund capital improvements in the budget, going to be difficult to do. Because basically you'd be putting, my recommendation last year when we went through the ad hoc was to increase that number to 3.5 million. And take kind of the savings that you've come up with from not bonding everything and growing what I would call cash. I would call capital improvements in the budget, I'd call that cash. But we just, at this point, and this is where Director Cummings is saying, let's have some discussion of the pros and cons of putting dollars into that line. We can do that, but at the end of the day, the increase is 19.2 million, which is a 5.64% increase.
Which gets to where you were going, Alderman Sullivan.
I would like to say, Mr. Chairman, if I could, like I said, last year we took a certain amount of money for SURF, for fiscal '25 expenses. We used a supplemental appropriation for, I believe it was 5 million, but it could have been 6. So again, that's using cash. That's taking what we had for a balance and using 5 million and putting it in the capital equipment reserve fund so you can spend it. We didn't do that this past fall. We don't really think we should, based on what I just said, I don't think we should do it this year. We should put it in the budget. But we do have the 5 million to fund it in this 1 year, because we have $15 million of assigned fund balance that we can draw down to 10 million. But you're not gonna do that in the next couple of months. What you're gonna do is calling us to remember that when we come before you and we recommend how much to use against the tax rate, use that 5, and hopefully we have 6 million from other sources such as surplus from revenue, surplus from appropriations not spent. So historically, we're in the 4, 5, 6 range on buying down the tax rate. This, if you so choose, we could put forth a funding mechanism for that first year. but it's totally up to discussion, and I am a proponent of not spending one-time revenue for ongoing expenses, but you can decide down the road without hurting people that you might be able to get some more length, get some more years out of the equipment that you're replacing and manage it that way. But that would be what I would recommend as something to think about.
Alderman Cleen?
I just have a quick question, and if it's something that's going to come up later, I'm happy to wait. You said something about being able to potentially work on the pension, FICA and Medi, I assume you mean Medicare, from the 4% to 3.5%. Where those are fixed costs based on the employees and salaries and everything that get paid to how would you, short of getting rid of employees? And salaries and
good.
so on.
Well, good question. Great question. You could make an argument that if the wages, if the rates in New Hampshire retirement system are set, if the employee rates are the same as they were this past year, your increase is going to be related to salary increases. So I think I could make a reasonable argument of bringing that down to 3.5 to match kind of the average salary increases in the operating departments.
Okay,
And the other thing that you'll learn when we file a budget, you'll learn that with wages between 3.5 and 4, that's gonna put a strain on the operating departments, to the extent they need any non-salary costs covered. But in summary, it's kind of it's really a rounding error at this point, as Director Cummings says, it's kind of like at the beginning.
okay.
But the one thing I will say is we try never to underfund pension costs, and it wouldn't be you'd have to lay anybody off, it would be, we'd have to get the money from another funding source.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That's it. Any other questions at this point?
So to summarize, Mr. Chairman, right now, we're modeling like a tick over 5.5% increase. So that's what that right-hand corner shows you, number. It's 5.64%. This is all fluid, subject to change, subject to conversation and discussion, but, what we're trying to show you is a level services budget. And what we're trying to provide you is just a scenario as to what a level services budget is, but there's other items and budget drivers that we need to take into consideration. And really, one of the goals is to try to understand one of the objectives, I should say, of tonight and hopefully future follow-on conversations is what is the goal that we're trying to set, so we can have some consensus as to where we're comfortably increasing the budget, or where we're comfortable seeing, a future tax increase, whatever it may be, whatever metric we want to use. But what we really want to do is make sure we understand that whatever we're doing, there's trade-offs. And so one of the things that you're seeing here is to provide a level service budget. Essentially, we can't increase capital spending in this operational budget. We did include SURF, though, this time around, in the operational budget. And so that's probably one of the biggest takeaways from this, but it's a conversation about how we want to continue planning for our FY26 budget.
Alderman Senate?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know this is sort of a macro level, and this may be a little bit of a micro question, but looking at this model, does this contemplate the discussion that's been ongoing regarding salary reevaluation?
Yes, go ahead, Director Cummings.
Great question. We're going to get to that in a later slide, but to answer your question, no, it doesn't.
I figured both those answers. Thank you.
Alderman Sullivan?
Thank you.
I've been clicking.
The amount that you have set aside, I'm trying to find it on here, but anyway, the SURF budget, I saw it earlier, I think it was $6 million. I think if you look at and again, maybe you don't know this yet, but typically in the SURF, you're gonna have vehicles that you pay for cash and then others that you plan to bond. Is that amount that is mentioned in an earlier slide, is that all cash, or is that just the total of the fund and to be determined later, cash versus bond?
Mr. Chairman, if I
Yes, go
may,
ahead.
this is the cash portion.
Okay,
To the extent there's any fire apparatus or any large pieces of equipment in solid waste in other areas, that would be bonded.
okay,
But this would be the cash portion.
thank you.
Alderman Glee?
Thank you. Just kind of getting back to salaries, when we're looking at the 3.5% overall operating budget, each of these departments, in the past, we've said 3.5%, or maybe say 1.5% for all of the departments, and then we've looked at things like fire and police, and you've kind of raised them up a little bit different than all of those because of just their operating costs and salaries and so on. Knowing what the contracts are, do we have contracts, salaries that are upcoming raises that are greater than 3.5%? And how is that going to affect this? Can we realistically stay within 3.5%?
Well, I'll try to answer that, but that's a better question to ask each individual department and chief
Okay.
or superintendent. I can tell you, a lot of the contracts have been negotiated, and they fall somewhere between 2.5% and 4%. So depending on the department, they may have a contract. I'll give schools right now as an example. I think they have 1 or 2 contracts that are technically at 4% right now. But those salaries in their overall line item may be a lower dollar amount compared to some of the other contracts that they have. And so it may balance. Plus, there's other line items in an operational budget which they may have to, in theory, pull back on to make this 3.5%. I think it's fair to say, though, that a 3.5% in this time is very tough to make. I think, that is, I think you could anticipate hearing from others that that's going to be very challenging to do. And I understand that, I recognize that, but I'm thinking about that bottom corner number.
Yeah.
That little over 5.5%, and anything we do here is gonna change that. And that's really the conversation at hand. Whatever we do, it's an equation, it's a balancing act. So if we're gonna add on one side, you have to be willing to increase on another side.
Okay.
And that's what I'm hoping to do.
Thank you.
So with that being said, I'd like to flip it over to Director Sullivan to talk about capital
Just
improvements.
before we do that, we're talking right now with these numbers and a starting point. This is a starting point for the mayor and his budget. He hasn't talked to the divisions yet. So this isn't necessarily what we'll get in a budget book. It could change. And so just keep that in mind. This is just a 55,000-foot level overview of where the mayor is starting on his budget process.
You know what, if I could just echo those comments again, that's really important. This is the start of a conversation. I truly anticipate a lot of what you're seeing tonight to evolve over the coming weeks and months. But what I'm hoping is it's an iterative process. So we're discussing it now, how we're seeing it, and then based on feedback and based on conversation with directors and superintendents and the chiefs and whatnot, you're gonna see a presentation that hopefully takes a lot of this input into consideration. Thank you.
Director Sullivan?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We're going to talk a bit more about capital in just a moment here in light of the $1.4 million that was discussed just a few minutes ago. But before we jump into that, in this coming year's process, I wanted to quickly talk about a parallel process that's been referenced certainly by this committee and as part of the ad hoc committee process, and that is the precedent process which goes through the Capital Improvement Committee, which I know Alderman Sullivan and Alderman Dowd have been intimately involved with this recent year. They are actually reacting and reading the room, in a sense, to what the ad hoc committee undertook for work as part of the prior fiscal year's work. and making some adjustments to the capital improvement planning process. So I wanted to talk quickly about that. For those who aren't familiar, CIP is actually a statutorily obligated process and is under the control of the planning board under state statute. And one of the unique things here in Nashua is that in order for a project to be bonded and debt service taken on, a project is actually required to be reviewed by the Capital Improvement Committee before it comes to the board, of Aldermen and is considered by the mayor. What we've heard, though, over the last year is that there's some misalignment and lack of clarity from what the committee has been doing in the past. You may have heard phrases used like that's an A1 project, or that's a D project, or that's a C2 project. And those terms probably don't have a lot of meaning to you when you're listening to them. And so one of the things that the staff and certainly the leadership of the committee have tried to undertake over recent months is actually redefining how projects are prioritized, so that whether it's the Budget Review Committee or a new iteration of the Ad Hoc Committee, they're getting some guidance from that group as far as what the projects are and generally how urgent they are. And so I just wanted to talk about what those changes might look like. It's going to sound a little bit more complex, but I assure you that the result will be more simple to understand as you undertake capital planning. As I mentioned, the goal here being clear prioritization, clear integration with the ad hoc capital planning process, and really ensuring that there's a clear handoff between the CIP process or CIC work and ultimately the capital process that's done by the Board of Aldermen. So Tim, if I could go to the next slide. And just to take a dip of, sort of a dip of the toe into the water here, and these graphics on the right are just for reference. This is guidance that's been issued to the directors for this year's capital process. And again, Alderman Sullivan and Alderman Dowd are very familiar with this. We're taking a more complex approach to actually gathering input from the divisions about their projects. We're going to use a slightly different scoring system that's been prepared by staff with guidance from the CIC members. Using a combination of what's referred to as the Eisenhower matrix, which is really an urgency ranking system, and triple bottom line assessment as well. Ultimately, all projects will be ranked, and again, it looks complex here, but all projects will be ranked across the 7 categories that go from urgency down to operations and maintenance. There'll then be a weight assigned to each of those scores. Again, a little complex, but a weight will be assigned. But ultimately, what will be generated is a numerical score for each project, going all the way up to 5. Each project will come before you. It could be a project gets a 4.25. It could be a project gets a 3.67. Those numbers may be meaningless by themselves, but you'll see a list of all projects with a rank assigned to them and a scoring assigned to them. So when you're undertaking this process, you'll understand clearly what the high priority projects were. And so the goal here is, again, to deliver a product that's most useful to you. If I could just go to the final slide that I have. Ultimately, the goal, in addition to that numeric ranking, is to provide you with a clear sense of over the 6-year capital plan schedule that's produced by the CIP, that you have a sense of what the immediate and high priority projects are in years 1 and 2, a sense of what those medium-term strategic projects might be that may not be fully baked, fully designed, fully contemplated, but are a need for the community. You get a sense of what those year 3 and 4 projects are. And then finally, what are the projects that are in the outer years of that 6-year process? Those things that are perhaps emergent as needs, or perhaps are not necessarily an urgent need, period, but are an economic development priority that may transcend in a way some of the other priorities in those outer years. That's something that we're working on in years 5 and 6. And I'll just make one final comment here. One thing that we are also considering internally more than anything is the idea of identifying projects beyond years 5 and 6. There are projects in year 10 or year 20 that we think that folks need to be aware of, the board needs to be aware of, that may not make it into that 6-year project list, but maybe something to keep an eye on as we move into those horizon years. And so ultimately, to close out, the goal is to deliver a more useful product to you through the CIP-CIC process, and we're hopeful that a revised scoring methodology and the hard work that's been done by the committee to date will yield that. And so I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, but I think we're going to move into this year's particular capital planning needs in just a second with director comments. Thank you.
Any immediate questions?
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
So taking that information, what we're hoping to do is now pivot with that information and have a conversation with the Board of Aldermen. And whether that is continuing with the ad hoc process or doing it to a new committee of the Board of Aldermen or doing it as part of the Budget Review Committee, we need to get some of that feedback from you all to hear how you'd like to do it. But we want to take that work and then have a conversation about how we can build it into our operating budget. And what we know now is in FY '26, we're gonna be level funding our capital improvements, which is $1.4 million. That's what we've been doing over the last couple of years through the budget process. And that is what I would anticipate us doing for FY '26. What we know is upcoming through the ad hoc process, we identified approximately $4.6 million in various type of capital improvement spending. And to be very clear, this is money we would use cash. So this wouldn't necessarily be any type of debt authorization. That's a different slide. But but we've identified about $4.5 million in the ad hoc process that we knew we would need to spend at some point over the next 5 years, and we had targeted FY '26. More recently, we did an outreach to the various departments to hear if their list or their identified capital needs had changed. To no surprise, there has been some changes. So we're gonna need to go through a little bit of a reconciliation process to make it work, but we know that we had originally, estimated a little over $4 million in capital investment needs. What we did in FY '25 is we used surplus funds from FY '24 to make those additional investments, and that was Stellos, the police training facility, the fire truck replacement, and the miscellaneous capital improvement projects that you all voted on more recently. So that we're gonna be needing to identify how we want to necessarily handle this moving forward. If it's the pleasure of the group to do it through the budget process, that is certainly something that we could look at and do. If you want to do it in the fall and use surplus and do supplemental appropriation, that is something that we could do. But we wanted to just telegraph for you now how we see this coming together. Next slide. And then, so similarly with the debt service planning that we did, we're trying to model a roughly $25 million of new bond authorization year over year over the next 5 years. We have in the queue what we have identified as approximately $17 million of new bonding right now that we would be anticipating needing, but we still need to reconcile that with what we believe may have changed over the last year or so, because again, this is a live document and it's fluid, and we're just starting to update the various documents. And one note I wanted to make folks aware of, when we did our work through the ad hoc process, we didn't have any type of inflationary factor in there. So now that we're moving beyond that 1 year, I'm gonna just telegraph for you all that the next time you see the Excel spreadsheet, you could anticipate having some sort of inflationary factor, just to be fair. Relative to the capital adjustments that the marketplace times that we're in, and making a capital adjustment based off of those market adjustments. So right now, the debt service is looking to be something that we can accommodate. I think we're seeing about a 2% increase year over year in our FY '26 budget. So what we know is we have some additional capacity there. So we can talk about how you and the mayor want to potentially use some of that money. And again, this just kind of goes into a little bit further detail that kind of identifies that, and I show how we might have some of that additional capacity. If you note, we originally had slated in the police training facility for $3.5 million. We ended up using cash for that, so we didn't use all of the modeled bonding debt that we thought we were gonna need. And then the $1.5 million for a new Amherst Street floor or roof at the fire station, in consultation with the fire department. They're not necessarily sure they're gonna need that at this time, so we may need to push that out, or we won't need as much money. So we're aware of the fact that there's some capacity within this model to make some adjustments. So pivoting now, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what we're seeing and have a little bit of a discussion based off of some of items that I've highlighted in my next slide, if I could. So we're talking about budget drivers, current issues, challenges that we're seeing. So, first and foremost, we're talking about operational budget increases of about 3.5%, health care and benefit increases of about 10%, level funding capital improvements, including SURF back in the operational budget. As CFO Griffin mentioned, our fixed costs, we need to keep watching that. That may need to go up. So we're going to have to keep an eye on that, but that's pensions, fuels, utilities, insurance, general labor increases where we're trying to keep contained at 3.5%, but we do know that we have the teachers with an expiring contract and the paras that's coming up in this fiscal year, and that's something that everyone needs to be aware of based on how those contract negotiations go. Will obviously affect the school's operational budget. There's a couple more items on the next slide. So, one of the reasons why we wanted to kind of have this conversation is because as we're developing some models and scenarios, we want to kind of talk about whether we should start thinking about inflation and tariffs. We need to think about general market trends that we may be seeing based off of the economy. Want to talk about maybe the evolving fiscal position of our federal government. Right now, everything that you're seeing plans for federal grants in our operating budget right now, as though we're getting our federal grants. So is there a scenario that we need to develop where maybe we don't rely on those federal grants? And we might need to plan for that, and if that's the case, we need to make some adjustments. Right now, we are making the assumption that we are continuing to get the federal funding that has been committed to us. We got some challenges that we've heard over the year or over the last couple of years that we need to talk about as we plan our operational budget in the future. That's trying to move the paving program into our operational budget. I've heard an interest in sidewalks more recently and general infrastructure improvements relative to sidewalks and how we might be able to increase the spending on that. We know that we have some National Transit System grant match and hydro capital improvements that we're going to need to accommodate for in our operating budget. These are all various budget drivers that I just wanted to kind of telegraph for you all now so you can kind of see these are the conversations we're having, and we would want to get some ideas from you so we can continue to move forward. So with that being said, Mr. Chairman, wanted to kind of open it up to a roundtable kind of conversation and hear what the body may be thinking based off of the information we've provided this evening.
So, one thing that you mentioned before is on the SURF program, we have the divisions looking at that right now because the acquisition time for vehicles is getting ridiculous, actually. And the phasing of when they can come in, when they have to be ordered, is probably going to have to be adjusted based on that long lead time. So there are things being done to try and make SURF a little more realistic. So that will be up and coming.
If I may follow that through, Mr. Chairman, if I'm understanding what you're saying, maybe you're suggesting that the whole 5 million may not be necessary? Is that what I'm hearing you say? So therefore, it would be a lower dollar amount?
Well, there's a potential for the way we actually pay our vendors, and that could impact how much money we need year to year. But we're too early in that process because right now, when we buy a truck and it's going to be 4 years to build, we have to pay for the full value up front. So there's perhaps negotiating we can do to lessen the initial out year.
Understood.
Questions? Alderman Cleen?
Yeah, I don't want to be the wet blanket, and I don't want to throw a monkey wrench into things, but I won't hide the fact that I'm a little anxious about what's happening up in DC with the threat of loss of grants and different things and departments closing and so on. And I don't want to run a parallel budget, but I think I'd like to kind of know from a high level, if some of that funding doesn't come through, what programs would have to close. I'm going to be honest with you, I'm hearing from my constituents about our bus situation. Would the paratransit continue? Would our bus situation, and that's exactly what I'm telling them, no, 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 which I try to keep it in a very calm voice. I don't want to send panic out there, so, and I don't want to send panic out there now. But I think when it comes to budgeting, I don't want to put a budget out there and suddenly have the rug pulled out from under, and we have to suddenly scramble. And I don't want to cause panic for our residents either. So I think for complete fiscal responsibility, I know all of you have been thinking about this and had many, many, many sleepless nights. But I think for the budget committee and for the rest of us as aldermen, I think we kind of have to know what a potential plan is if the rug is pulled out from underneath us. So I'm not going to hide my anxiety and feeling in my own sleepless nights over that.
Well, I think that's something we can work towards. I don't think that's something we have tonight.
No, no, I don't mean tonight. I'm just saying, as this budget
And-
process
yeah.
is going, I think it's something that is a realistic, and like I said, I don't want to have two budgets. I don't want to have a shadow budget, but I think some alternatives of,
Scenario plan.
if this gets pulled away, what is the alternative? And maybe the alternative is it just gets shut down, period. And I pray that that's not the case, but,
Yeah, that's scenario
and I
planning.
think
Yep.
people may need to hear some of that, so.
Yeah,
thank you.
trying to figure out what the federal government's doing is almost
I don't
impossible.
think it's possible to think of what they could be doing.
We
but-
had a discussion today, Title I funds for schools. We have 6 schools that rely on Title I funds.
We can't figure out what Concord's doing, let alone.
And I was going to also mention, yes, the state budget's going to come out, and how much are they pushing down on local taxpayers? So all of that evolves, and we're going to be working this budget between now and June, so. Yes, Alderman Kelly.
Lee Kelly,
Very
it's very confusing.
Nothing like Alderman Sullivan. I just wanted to put a finer point on that. I sort of wrote down scenario planning. What does it look like if we get no funding, some funding, and zero funding, which I imagine you guys are thinking of. But I guess my question is, as you're looking at this, what are the highest concerns for our budget if, no federal funding comes in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Megan?
For the record, Megan Karen, Chief of Staff. I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't, and I don't know anyone who does. And that includes folks at our state agencies and federal workers as well. Quite frankly, it's come down to people passing around different version of memos from federal agencies to try to parse out to try to get those numbers to scenario plan. High level, I think we would see the most impact on transportation, urban programs, and public health, and that's besides education. For this federal freeze that's now in court, they're saying that Title I, Head Start, IDEA, that's all safe, but that's safe for now. We also haven't touched, and I don't want to speak for the schools, again, this is high level, but free and reduced lunch. In moving forward, even if we do receive funding, it seems like the priority of these federal agencies have changed. And Matt, I don't know if you want to speak to the guidance from the DOT, but where they're prioritizing their funding, Nashua wouldn't necessarily fit into those criteria.
Sullivan?
Happy to speak to that. And I'll comment broadly before I address what Ms. Karen said, and that is that we also have several discretionary grants that are in various stages of process, whether it's the Library Plaza project, the Brownfields grant, or many of the federal pass-through funds that we receive that perhaps aren't directly funding staff or personnel time, but will fund or are funding significant programs or capital projects that the city is undertaking. And that includes transportation infrastructure grants, quite frankly. whether it's the Walnut Street Oval, the West Pearl Street project, or any of the projects that we've talked to this or other groups about, we are not clear on where those projects stand. And to Ms. Karen's point, we're hearing, of course, that funds are going to be prioritized and allocated to communities or states with very high birth rates. And I mean, this is factual. This is what's been stated in DOT memos. Obviously, the city of Nashua, the state of New Hampshire would not rank highly when we look nationally when it comes to birth rates. And so I think we have significant concern about how funds are going to be directed to different states. I'll just comment, of course, transportation is a huge impact. We do have some city funds that go into that system, but it represents only less than 20% of the entire budget of the program. And so certainly we would have to make significant changes to the way that service is delivered and to whom in order to keep any form of public transportation running. But we have not done that scenario planning as of yet.
If I could follow up?
Follow up, Alderwoman Kelly?
Thank you. And thank you for some insight into the day-to-day. As we are going into budget season and you're considering those things, are there, what's the word I'm looking for, maybe a trigger, whether you're going to actually touch that grant because you're not sure, or maybe we're going to hold off on this because we still don't know for sure? Like, what does that look like? Because it could have implications to the budget, right?
It absolutely could, Matt Sullivan for the record, it absolutely could. I think one of the critical path items in front of us right now that we're actively talking about is in light of the uncertain status of these funds even today. We are being very careful and taking great care in executing any large contracts or otherwise putting the city in an obligation to take on expenses that reimbursement will not be guaranteed for. And so those conversations are ongoing, they're changing every day. The entire city team who's here this evening has been meeting actively on this issue, and it can change at any time. But I will say that when we look forward to the budget, in the event that we receive clear communication that any one program or set of programs is not going to be funded moving forward, I expect that we'll have an internal conversation and, as you saw several weeks ago, contemplate potentially an emergency meeting of the Board of Aldermen to discuss each program on a case-by-case basis. And I frankly think that's how things are going to be done. This body, the mayor, are going to need to evaluate if you are to include city funds to support some of the programs where federal monies are cut, how do you prioritize those projects or those programs rather? And that's going to be a very difficult conversation when it happens.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could.
Director Cummings.
Thank you. So, and just to follow on to those points, we're doing that right now, and in fact, in your packet for tomorrow night, you're going to see that I submitted a communication relative to the Hunt Memorial Building and a renovation project that in theory we should begin and start, but I want to make sure it's explicitly clear that there may be some risk in the fact that it's a reimbursement grant of just under $500,000 that right now we're being told that we'll receive it. But if that changes, we are going to enter into a contract for about $1.4 million. And so if we don't receive those funds, we wouldn't be reimbursed. And I want the mayor and I want this body to know and be aware of that. So what we're trying to do is be as diligent as possible and try to be as upfront as we can, and so everyone is aware of the liability and the risk that we currently face. And it's unfortunate that we're in these times, but nonetheless, we're doing the best that we can.
Alderwoman Kelly?
Thank you for doing that work. I don't want to add undue administrative burden, but it feels a little bit like when we were in COVID. And during COVID, we got a almost daily sort of situational update, wondering if, maybe it's not daily, but there might be a way to sort of start folding us into that.
Yeah. Alderman Sullivan?
Thank you. I didn't want to continue the federal discussion, but I will. But just I want to ask the question of the $358 million in the operating budget. That you've modeled, forecasted, how much of that is contingent on federal funding?
Pass the hot potato. Who wants to
I
handle that
want to
one?
clarify, contingent on or uses?
Of the $358 million
Yep.
that runs this city,
Yep.
how much comes from the federal government?
I'd like to get back to you. I don't want to necessarily
That's fine.
give the wrong answer. I mean, I can say it's, on schools alone, it's about $4 to $5 million. And I would have to check general government, but,
Maybe,
and that's not projects, that's just operational staff. So we would have to get back to you, but unless
So,
CFO Griffin knows.
there's a couple of
Mr. Griffin?
ideas, Mr. Chairman, John Griffin, CFO. The immediate link is, as Mr. Director Sullivan said, you can't run a fully fledged transit system with 20% coming from the city. So whatever that number is, if that's 600,000, 800,000, you wouldn't need that. The other is, most of the monies are tied up in the, if you look back on the spending cap, they're in the special revenue funds line, including grants of 60 million. So they're not in the 358.
Right.
Those are non-grants.
That's kind of my point, is I want to make sure, we're here mostly talking about the operating budget. I understand that there are federal funds in play, but we're here to talk about the general fund and the operating budget of the city. I don't want to run down the rabbit hole of whether or not we're going to get federal funding if it doesn't affect that much of the operating budget to turn the lights on in the city, if you know what I mean. Okay.
Any other questions? Oh, yes.
Thank you,
Tebow, Alderman
Chairman.
Tebow.
That question that Alderman Sullivan just asked, and then looking at Director Sullivan, his reaction to that. So I get what he's saying about the grant part, but the operating budget itself, are there federal funds inside that $350 million budget that are federal funds, or is it just what CFO Griffin was talking about and it's down in that other? There's got to be some federal funds in there too.
Let me see if I may, Mr.
Yes, go ahead, Director Cummings.
So I understand both points that are being made, and I think what I'm trying to distill is essentially, and I'm going to use schools as an example because that's the one that's freshest in my memory because I looked at it earlier today. So roughly, the school department receives between $4 and $5 million in federal grants in some sort of way. That translates into roughly 100-ish positions. And so what you'll need to potentially ask yourself is, does the city of Nashville want to continue and pick up those 100-ish positions because they're not counted for in the general operating budget? But what I can tell you is they provide core services that the education department counts on. They are day in and day out teachers. So although may not be reflected in the 350 figure, you will not be able to provide the same level of service.
So just to follow up on that, having a few years on the Board of Ed, we're required to teach the children of Nashua in a public school system. And typically, if those positions are absolutely necessary in the day-to-day education, and they're covered by a grant now, and maybe some of them have been for years, then we'd have to pick up the cost as a city. So we don't know where that's going to fall out. We think we've heard that Title I is safe. That's a big chunk of it. So it's too early to make any final decisions in that realm. And a lot of these things will change over time. So we'll have to just keep our finger on the pulse and see what happens. Alderman Tebow.
Follow up to that. So back to Alderman Sullivan's question then, even though some of these things may be grants and federal funded, to keep some of the lights on, it sounds like we would need some of that. Even though it's not part of the operating budget, we would still need some of that to keep some of the lights on in some of the places in the city if they went away. Fair?
We'd have
Yep.
to add to the
Yes.
358.
Right.
And speaking for myself, that's why I didn't mean to make the face, but it's, that question of why, is it keeping the lights on is a good question. And the answer is if you want to continue those core services, as Director Cummings said, the answer is yes, there is an impact, no question. If you decide to eliminate those services, there is no impact.
There's one other piece, and that is at the state level, there are some less than informed legislators trying to pass legislation to try and get around the adequate funding by the state for education by saying that they want to eliminate certain courses being taught in the schools from being funded by the state. And it's a quite long list, but the pushback has been immense. I mean, I think Megan was 10-1 or 11, it was huge. The numbers were huge. So chances of that going through are slight, but the state is trying to impact the monies that they give for education. If the court decision held true and the state had to come up with that money, now that's another chunk of bucks that we'll get that we hadn't anticipated, but not too many people think that that's going to go through to the end. So that's something that's flowing. I got Alderwoman Kelly and Alderman Sullivan and Clee.
Yeah, just wanted to comment, I think it's starting to be coalesced by everyone else, but even though it's a $60 million line item, there's so many things that are tied to that that we will have to decide whether we want to keep going. We're talking about the milfoil program, we're talking about money for HIV, we're talking about community health workers, we're talking about our bus system. Are we going to shut it down completely? Because they are not funded by us right now. So we will have to decide, and in some cases, we may not be legally allowed to reduce our service, especially with the schools. I know I don't know enough about the budget, but like, we were mandated to hit our ELL and make sure that these students were getting the services a number of years ago. So if that funding goes away, we probably are still legally obligated to make sure that there are enough teachers in our school district to make sure we're meeting that. So I think to say they're separate is a little bit disingenuous.
Alderman Sullivan?
Yes, in relation to school funding, you had mentioned at the early on in your presentation that we got additional school revenue from the state.
Well, maybe I can handle that. John Griffin, CFO. You recall, thinking 2 years ago, the mayor and I came in and said, we have 39 million, we better spend it wisely. And fortunately, they increased that number about 20 million. And since then, I was pleased, last year, we got a pretty good increase, and this year, prior to not sure exactly what's going on with the budget up at the State House, but we're supposed to get another 5 million that will help. So those are the monies, significant increases in the state kicking in, notwithstanding the big court case that will probably end up being very difficult to fund.
So, in
Follow-up?
keeping, thank you. In keeping with that, could you please supply, obviously not now, because you don't know it off the top of your head, since 2020, how much the city of Nashua has gotten from the state for education, year by year? Because I'd be curious, because it comes in just into the general fund, correct? It doesn't,
Correct.
yeah, it doesn't, it just comes in as revenue. So it's hard to sometimes go through the financial statements and figure out what we get from the state. I'd like to see it since 2020 and what's happening with that.
Yeah, it is hard, and just some additional information. I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago. You folks might have been up there in the legislature, just terrible notifications, like, for the mayor and I to have to come in here and say we got 39 million. I think we were saying we needed probably, a 10% increase or something? And but what will definitely be an absolute nightmare for tax caps is the volatility plus and up and down of that particular item. You can't sustain 39 million, 60 million down to 39 million. Because you have to rely on that revenue. More so projecting revenue as opposed to waiting till the end of the year and saying, okay, how much should I charge in taxes? But I will definitely get the committee those numbers.
Thanks.
Did you have something, Alderman Clee?
Just, no. I had a question, but I'm gonna let it go.
Any other
Thanks.
questions? Oh, by hair, Alderman Kelly.
I wanted to know if we have I know lots of things are fluid right now, but if we have a time when we're gonna get our budget books. And start
What?
that process.
Time limit for what? Did you say
Budget
time?
books.
Budget books and start our budget committee hearings. Is that better?
Okay, I was going to address that before we get through.
Oh, okay.
I have asked the mayor to try and his team, which is going to be difficult with this year's budget because of all the variables now, to get us a budget, mayor's budget by the 1st of May, or real early May, so we can get started probably a couple of weeks earlier than we have before for our meetings. And that may require a special Board of Aldermen meeting to present the budget rather than a regular Board of Aldermen meeting. So that's still being looked at. I mean, he's got to meet with all the divisions, and he and his people have got tons of work to do relative to their portion of the budget, so they're going to try.
Follow up.
Follow up?
So I just remembered when I first got here that we were meeting when there was snow on the ground. So I looked it up. And back in 2019, we started our budget hearings in March. So I'm just wondering what happened that we're pushing it to May and that we're really only giving ourselves a month, essentially, to go through a very complex budget and pass
I
it.
think the thing that changed it was, when we started the budgets early, we'd start in the process, we'd get all the way along, and things started changing left and right, and everything we did had to be revised. So in an effort to try and have more solid numbers, they moved it closer to May. Now we're trying to, because we don't want to be out here every single night, trying to move it. We want to be able to absorb the information from the divisions. And there'll be a lot of complex questions this year, so we're trying to give ourselves more time. And as you know, the budget meetings aren't the only meetings we have. So there are only so many days in a week. So I already have Donna trying to block out dates, but it will depend on when we get the budget. Also, I've asked again this year for everybody on the budget committee to get a 3-ring binder of the budget, not the
I love the binder. It's great.
stamped one. Yes, Alderman Wiltshire.
I agree with Alderwoman Kelly. There's no reason we can't get the budget before May 1st. There's no reason. In 25 years on this board, just the last few years, we've been getting the budget in May. And, you know, people are starting, the kids are getting out of school, graduating, all this stuff is going on, and we're in a crunch, right? We have to get the budget passed, and we're getting it so late.
The last year-
I would request that you ask the mayor to have the budget to us by mid-April.
Yeah.
Agreed.
That's my request.
Sort of asked them today that we'll see what we can do. Last year, we got it mid-May, so I'm trying to move it up at least 2 weeks.
I request April 15th and
I will.
Tax day.
Director
agree with
Cummings,
that.
would you take that back to
Yes, sir, no problem.
Thank you.
Alderman Sullivan?
Well, for the record, it is February 10th, and we have numbers. I understand that these are a forecast, but it's February 10th, and we seem to have, the concrete is poured, meaning it's, you know, they're in play, we have some numbers to go by, so I think that an April 15 deadline should be done. I mean, it's, 60 days to get it done, but I think, to Alderwoman Kelly's point and President Wilshire's point, I think the more time that we have to pour over this, especially some of the situations that are coming at us fast and furious, I think it would be a good idea to do that. High level, red flags that I see, as I mentioned before. Well, let me say this, because it was alluded to. The conversation that we're having, the slides that we've built, the numbers that we've looked at, the mayor isn't here. It's his budget. Where does this conversation go? Is he hearing this? Did he build this? What happens with all this? Because it's his budget, but he's not here. Is this your budget? Is this his budget? What is this?
For Cummings,
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, this isn't a budget. What this is the start of a conversation about how we would like to draft and frame a budget. And I thought it would be constructive to have more like of a work session to kind of talk through some of these bigger picture issues. Why did I really want to have this conversation? It's centered around the concerns that were brought up relative to capital improvements. And so in the operating budget, or last year, in the operating budget, we carried $1.4 million. And then during the ad hoc process, I tried to illustrate that I thought we were going to need to use supplemental or cash to be able to do some of the capital spending that we were talking about. And then when the time came to do that, I heard some concerns that it wasn't in the operating budget. Well, I wanted to just forecast or telegraph that we're going to be in the same situation again next year. And I just want folks to be aware of that so we could plan accordingly. And so I really thought it would be good to just have a 50,000-foot view of what the budget drivers are, how we're kind of constructing the budget. And again, what I said at the beginning, it's an equation. We have to make it balance. If we're giving in one area, we might have to take away in another, or spend more in another and take away somewhere else to get to where we agree to as a goal. And as you can see in this operational budget, we're suggesting that there will be no additional capital improvement spending. We're going to stay constrained at that $1.4 million. And I just want everyone to be aware of that, and then we'll move forward. I'd like to do that with some of the other budget drivers here as well, and so then we can start to have a crafting of a budget that will come over the next few weeks, that all this is working in conjunction with the mayor and at his direction.
Can I follow up on that?
yes, Megan?
So, and I think just to add on to what Director Cummings is saying, is that over the past few years, we've heard some of the feedback that, the board would like to move away from escrows or supplementals. And so we understand it's a tight time frame. So as we are moving forward, we wanted to paint a picture of what a budget would look like without any of those things in the budget. So we're at, what was it, 5.6?
5.6, yep.
Yes, so 5.6%, and that's without including some of those items that the board would have liked to see in the budget, if that makes sense. So that's really a starting point for us, is 5.6. I'll say in this scenario. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go to Alderman Wilshire in a second, but the mayor hasn't talked to any of the divisions yet. So he has to formulate his budget. I understand mid-April, that's what I was shooting for. But, and it's going to fall upon he and his staff to have a hell of a lot of meetings, shorter period of time, but we'll see if it can get done. Alderman Wilshire?
Yeah, I truly appreciate this meeting. I appreciate the staff that are here to explain this to us. I still don't buy the idea that this is a tougher year than last year or the year before, because it's budget season. It's the time. It's the effort. I appreciate it, but it's not different or harder than all the prior years. We say that every year. I don't buy it. I also don't buy that we could probably get the budget by April 1st if that was how the mayor wanted to present it. I think we could have it by then. I'm not sure the reason that it's been pushed off.
Okay.
I'm not happy about it.
Okay. Alderman Senate?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I believe you just answered my question, but I'm just going to ask it anyway to put it out there. We've seen a roadmap of what a potential budget looks like with these constrictions, 3.5 increase across each department, the 5.6 total. This directive has not been communicated to the departments yet. Am I understanding that correctly? Okay.
Right, so if I may, Mr. Chairman?
All
So
right.
we wanted to
Rick
have
Cummings?
this conversation this evening to make sure we were discussing it with you all, and then I would anticipate a communication going out tomorrow or the day after that talks about this, and, you know, you're gonna see formalized guidance going out. And then, I guess the question at hand is, if some of these departmental budgets come in higher, where else are we going to pull back in other areas that we may need to? And that's just a question that doesn't need to be answered tonight, but that's something that you need to be thinking about, or you need to also be willing to maybe see a budget increase higher than the 5.6. And that's okay too. Maybe it's 7 or 8%, and that's okay. I mean, but that is maybe what we're looking at. And what we're just trying to do is start that conversation.
Follow-up on that?
Follow up, Alderman Senate.
Thank you. So contemplating the frustration that I'm hearing from my colleagues in regard to the timelines that we're looking at the risk of repeating myself where I have in other areas of concern that I have through the city, if the timeline that we're asking for is being deemed unfeasible, is it possible that going forward, we start having these conversations earlier so that we're not in this situation where we're talking early May being really kind of a time crunch, and we could get back to maybe some of those March or April budgets arriving, so we have the time to really dissect it ahead of the end of the fiscal year?
I had that conversation today with the mayor and Director Cummings and Megan, and he agreed that in subsequent years, we would start this sooner, if the board so desired, which I think it does. But we're at this date now, we can't go back. So there's a number of steps that need to be done, and now I guess the guidance is try to get it done by mid-April. Alderman Tebow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, exactly what you just said, there is steps involved, right? So should we get it sooner? Yeah. And I do think it's going to be a difficult year, because if I was a department after we've been through the last couple of years, and I mean, we've been attacked the last couple of years for not being able to curb spending. So in a year like this, where things are probably going to be taken away, 3.5, getting departments to be at 3.5, I mean, fire is always higher, education is always higher. Getting somebody to be like, my budget will only be 1% this year, it's just probably not going to fly. So I think that it's going to be higher. And I think there are some things that departments have to look at inside themselves and decide what can they do without this year, and maybe try to get it closer to what the mayor wants or what this scenario is. But the one thing I'm concerned about is this is not the budget, and I can see it tomorrow being posted on social media and in emails and on papers or whatever, saying, hey, Nashua just came up with their budget, here's their budget, I got it right here. It's not the budget, it's not even close in a lot of ways, because there's a lot of things that have to happen between now and the time, not including the departments going through it, but then us going through it. We can cut stuff out of it as well. So I think there's a lot to go. I think this was a good preliminary meeting, just to kind of go through the steps, go through some of the areas that Director Cummings wanted to show us, and the different departments that are here. But I think at the end of the day, it's gonna be different than what they're showing today. So I don't want to get all kinds of calls tomorrow saying, I hear the budget's out, why is it like this? Because it's just the beginning.
Other comments? No? Okay, also, tonight
Mr. Chairman, if I could, just general, if I could, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to get just the general reaction from the group as to what they're seeing relative to, a little bit over a 5% increase in the operating budget. That's what we're modeling here, and, are we on the right trajectory? Or that's how I started this conversation, or would you like to see it change? I mean,
I'm going to let everybody put their own opinion out, but I'd be surprised if not all the aldermen would like to see it lower. So, but I'll let everybody comment. Oh, who was, it must have been Alderman Wiltshire.
Yeah, I'd like to see it lower. I don't think there's any reason for a 5.6% budget increase. I mean, we just had that last revaluation, and, you know, people are not happy with us. And, yeah, 5.65, I wouldn't support that higher budget.
Okay. I appreciate the
At all.
feedback.
Anyone? Alderwoman Kelly?
I was going to say the same thing, but I also just wanted to put a point on the budget process. So I don't care when we get the budget. We've put out when we want it, but I refuse to be pushed through this year and have to hit the deadline and, oh, we can't ask those questions because the deadline's coming up. So if we don't get it till later, don't expect that it's definitely going to hit when it's supposed to hit. I feel like that's happened multiple years in a row of like, we have to pass it by the state. I want enough time to look at it and be thoughtful with it, and I'm going to.
Alderman Cleen?
I'm not on your committee, but I can tell you that when it comes to the Board of Aldermen, unless there's some severe justification of it, I don't want to see it go up that high. I want to see a lower number myself. But I do also agree with Alderwoman Kelly. There were a lot of times when meetings had to get changed last year, and there was a lot of swapping around, which was truly making my head spin, trying to make meetings. A bunch of meetings got pushed together because there was time constraints and so on. And there were some departments, because there wasn't a lot of change, who just didn't even bother having them come to meetings. So I think this, getting it sooner than later, as President Wilshire had said, is truly important.
But we can control the meetings, right?
Alderman Devo?
Thank you. I actually want to increase it to about 10%. I mean, who wants it increased? I don't think anyone here would say they want it increased, right? So, I mean, my point there is, yeah, we're going to want it lower. I think in this time, it's going to be hard pressed to get it too much lower without us really making some hard decisions, which is fine. If that's what we want to do, well, let's do it. But I would ask the departments to do it first before it gets to us. But I think it's going to be very difficult to get it lower, but I hope we can. I'm on board with it. It's just, it's going to be hard.
Appreciate that.
Alderman Senate?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I mean, right along with my colleagues, I'd like to see a lower budget. 5.6 that's a tough pill to swallow, given the current economic climate. To Alderman Clee's point as well, about the inconsistency of the meetings, I should preface by recognizing that I understand the complexity of arranging these and scheduling these. I know that's a tall task in of itself, but something I'd like to see as we take this on, and again, it goes, again, beating that dead horse to, getting that budget as early as we can, is giving each of these departments that are going to be coming before us time to breathe. Because I felt like last year, and last year was my first year on the budget committee, and really trying to wrap my hands around it. And I felt that some nights we had so many departments in front of us that it almost felt impractical or impossible to ask the necessary questions and to really digest the information, where we're just moving on from departments that are equally important to one another. And so I'd like to see, if at all possible, more spread across these, with each one given time to breathe so that it can be questioned, vetted, and we can get a good budget.
Alderman Sullivan?
I was surprised by the 5.6% number. I believe the mayor had said in his comments that he was aiming for 4%. But again, so that's kind of why I questioned that before. Obviously, I think that 4% is better than 5.5% or 5.6. I'm also concerned about, as I said earlier, how close we're coming to that spending cap. And considering that all grants, everything counts against the cap. So bumping right up against it concerns me. So those are the two things. the increase and then the spending cap as my attention.
Anyone else? If not, the next item on the agenda is public comment. Name and address for the record.
Sure. Lori Ortolano, 41 Berkeley Street. I really appreciate the two ladies who spoke about the need to get the budget sooner. There's been a real shift away from the time looked at, and I did a graph of the time that used to be spent on the budget versus currently, and it's gone down by like 50% over the last 3 years because of the time of when you get the book. And I think it's not right, and I don't think the attention is being given to it for the board. I think too much is crammed in, even for the public to come out and ask questions. It becomes much more limited for us as well. And I think we've had some big increases and changes going on in our city that warrant more attention to be paid to it. Past boards did a better job doing that, and I think we need to get back to that. I'm really disappointed with the increase, or the suggested increase. I think you're going the wrong way. And I'd like to know how much of the budget is associated with salaries. Salaries and contract commitments, union contracts, what percentage of the budget is that? Because it's got to be very high. And then the discretionary spending, what's the discretionary spending? Because I think you're going to find that most of this budget is eaten up by salaries and contracts. And given that, you have to talk about salary reduction to get serious about getting control of this budget. It can't be any other way. And I suggested that before, and nobody has spoken about salary reduction. It's real. You know, you have to look at departments that are heavy and decide what you're going to change and what positions are going to be eliminated. What attrition do you have going on this year? What positions are being retired out, and potentially are there one or two that you don't have to bring in? Not holding all the positions, but actually reducing them. It's the only real way to make an impact. I think the tax bills from last year really smacked people hard, and I think you have to be sensitive. And I'm really concerned not about what's going on federally, but what about in our state? Has anyone talked to our county commissioner on what they're facing with the county budget? Because that'll be a portion of our tax rate. What about at the state level? With the state budget, what do we anticipate coming back? Because they know they're cutting 6%. They are cutting positions because they have to, because there literally isn't the business profits from the businesses of this state to fund the coffers. Those situations exist for us in Nashua. So I think the reality of positions wasn't even touched on. And that this, to me, just wasn't a realistic number, and you have to talk about positions at some point. Thank you.
Okay, I don't think there's anyone else for public comment? All right, before we get into comments from Alderman, I think everybody on the Budget Committee has a copy of the expendable trust funds and capital reserve. We're gonna have a meeting to go over those. Just be advised that we can't do anything with any one of those without submitting legislation to do it. So, I'll be working with Don and John Griffin as what would be required to expend something down to zero or get rid of it entirely. It would take a piece of legislation for each one of them, I believe. But I'll have to check with legal on that as well. And we'll also have to have the spending authority people here because they have the authority to spend. Unless it's, you know, there are a few that are board aldermen, a few that are mayor, but there's library, schools, DPW. So I gave you the list to look it over, to come up with questions, and we'll have a meeting to just focus on that in and of itself.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I'm not sure I received anything regarding that, but was that the Board of Aldermen members want to have a meeting to review the expendable trust funds?
Yeah, the Budget Committee. This is out of the budget book last year.
Oh, okay.
The other thing that we would need is an update on anything transpired and all that since this was put out. Some of these things may have been spent, some of them added to, so some would have to go through and figure out where they're all at.
But I guess I'm not clear on what is the objective, to figure out which funds can be canceled and,
Well, some of the Board of Aldermen have indicated that there are items that are in here that nobody's touched in 10 years. There is significant money on some departments that they're not spending it, so why aren't they spending it and asking for money from the budget when they have money out of this account? Those are just hypothetical examples of going through each one. I know, that we're not going to go through every expenditure out of each one of them. We're just going to address each one and see, who's got control of it? When was the last time somebody spent something out of it? And is it something we can get rid of? And the other question that came up in this regard was, if we do away with this funding, can it be put in the general fund? That's a legal question probably, so.
yeah, I think it's a great time to look at it if we're going to go forward with a tax cap. I haven't been here the last 15 years and learning what happened the previous 20. A lot of monies was saved and put into these trust funds so that they had a pot to look at if they needed it.
Right
So
now,
if you
there,
come up with a different approach and, you combine some of these, you might be able to use it more effectively going forward.
there is, and as we go through this, there are some of these that are holding accounts. We have one for plowing, which we may need this year, where if we had a year we didn't spend money, like last year on plowing, some of that money went in, or all of it went into that expendable trust fund, so that we have bad years, we don't have to go and ask for more money, we can get the money out of that. There are also a lot of these that are set up to be able to accept donations. So if somebody wants to donate, hypothetically, to the library, they have a place they can put the money.
Right.
All right, so I gave you the list to look at, and then we'll have a meeting and see what we can find out. Yes, Dawn?
Dawn Enright, Treasurer Tax Collector. I just wanted to mention that if you want to see the current balances, they're on the monthly financials that are printed. So if you're looking at the handout that you just distributed and you want to know if it is a zero balance, you can go to the monthly financials.
Can you get me a hard copy?
Sure.
Alderman Clee?
Are you on?
We're on automatic comments now.
Okay, good.
Alderman Clee.
I did want to make a comment. It was relative to a comment that had been made. There was a comment that was made that the business taxes have dropped in the state, and I want to make it very clear, the reason why the business taxes have dropped is because the state continues to drop the rate of the business tax, the business tax rate. So they're dropping their revenues and they're hitting the municipalities with that loss of revenue. So I just want to make that very clear, that that's a self-inflicted wound that the state is doing to themselves. Thank you.
Alderman Debo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to stress again, and just before that, I was one of the ones that asked for the expendable trust funds, just so we could, as we're doing the budget planning, that we understand these better and understand, what to do. And I know Alderman Sullivan's been also asking, so I figured it would be good for us to understand these better. It's my first year on the budget committee, or the first term on the budget committee. So my thing is, it was mentioned in public comment again, 5.6% budget. I just want to stress, this is not the budget. The budget is not at 5.6%. This is a framework. We've given feedback. We will give more feedback as we meet with the different departments. The goal, even the mayor was saying it's going to be less than 5%, or that's what he wants anyway. So I just want to make sure tomorrow, everybody's out there in the world saying, hey, they just passed the 5.6% budget, because that is not the case and it's not true. And I know how things get spread around here. We will work to make it much less than that, but this is just a starting point with some numbers plugged in so we can see how it all plays out. There's going to be variables that happen between now and that last budget meeting that we have that will affect this good or bad. So, and we got to react to them as they happen. So I just want to be very clear on that. I think this is just the start. This is the beginning, and hopefully we get things earlier. Hopefully we can have a better budget season than we did last year as far as the planning of it and preparing for it a lot better than we did. And a couple of us have, had our second year here on the budget committee, and hopefully that helps as well, so.
Just if anybody saw the Union Leader today, the school budget in Manchester just got put in at well over 4%.
They got their budget?
No.
Alderman Dowd.
The school board put their budget into the Board of Aldermen. The Board of Aldermen they haven't, city budget hasn't been passed, no. But they are ahead.
I also noticed that. I was looking at that. I will say, just a compliment to the people in this room, that our budget has a lot of really good information around what each department is doing, and some of the other ones I've seen are just numbers on a page. So I do appreciate the work that has been done to give us some real insight into what each department is doing when we pick up that book. And I understand that takes a lot of time and energy for you guys, so thank you for doing that. Can I ask a clarifying question on the funds? I know we're in remarks, but you said something that just confused me.
I just had Tom Lopez go through my mind. I was going to say no. Yeah,
I'm not gonna let you say no. So we have this list, we're gonna go through it, but I think you said, and I understand correctly, maybe it's not for all of them, in order to make any changes to that, we're gonna have to have a piece of legislation per. So if we decide to close one, that has to have a piece of legislation. Is that true?
Each one of the expendable trusts was formed by a piece of legislation.
Yeah.
And unlike some people in Washington, we just can't say, no, the heck with it, it's gone. It has to be legislated.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure going in, I knew what I was looking for. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Alderman Wiltshire.
Yeah, just, my frustration this evening is not with anyone in this room. I just want that out there.
Anyone else for aldermanic comments? Seeing none, Alderman Wiltshire.
Move to adjourn.
Motion is to adjourn. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We adjourned at 8:36.